is a student of Dr. Teresa Lee, who is unable to be here, so I'm taking the honor to introduce you, and we're looking forward to your talk.
I am a student of Dr. Reed's. I took her literary criticism class last fall, and one of the papers that we wrote, we had to choose a type of criticism and write about it. We had to explain it from a viewpoint of someone who has never taken the class, who doesn't know what's going on, but explain it in a way that they can understand without taking the course. The criticism that I chose was postmodernism because I could relate to it, and I found a lot of examples that I feel like I could explain it to a person who hadn't taken the course. Some examples of postmodern film or literature would be the movie Memento. It has elements of bricolage and fragmentation, which leads to a hyper-reality through the photos in the film. Another example is She Kills Monsters, which the genre department just recently did. It has elements of fragmentation, bricolage, and a hyper-reality for the main character, Tilly. And then an actual piece of literature, Naked Lunch, which combines paranoia, erotica, detective fiction, and science fiction as an example of fragmentation. My paper basically discusses the elements that are crucial to understanding and applying postmodern criticism to literature and film. And when approaching the postmodern criticism, the elements that stood out to me the most were fragmentation, which is brought on by deconstruction, bricolage, and the recurring side effect of hyper-reality. I realized that more often than not, postmodern literature and film have one, if not all, of these aspects within the piece. Upon my initial study into fragmentation, I examined Jacques Derrida's essay of grammatology, his discussion of the views which a deconstructionist holds when analyzing works of art. Derrida states that our reading must be intrinsic and stay within the text, and this basically states that our analysis must stay within the work in order to break it down and to its key components, translate it, and then determine its pure signified or true meaning. By understanding deconstructionism, the thought process of the fragmentation was clear by deconstructing the piece. I was able to understand it by itself, and furthermore, the fragmentation that those deconstructed pieces outside of the text in order to mold it and create it into a new meaning. When doing my research into fragmentation, I came across an essay by Roland Barthes called Mythologies, Photography, and the Electoral Appeal. In this essay, Barthes addresses the relationship between photographs and the electoral machination of a candidate. And the element of fragmentation is evident in that an idea or a belief is being taken from the Conservative Party and inserted into the medium of photography in order to convince the general public that the candidate is upholding the sanctity of their party and inevitably producing a desired outcome. Despite going against the credence that fragmentation, according to Peter Berry, is an escape from the claustrophobic embrace of fixed systems of belief, Barthes' observations of photography in relation to political elections is a great example of how postmodernists use fragmentation to further society and their beliefs. Another key element that I researched was Jean-Francois Lyotard's suggested concept of bricolage. According to Claude Levi-Strauss, bricolage is defined as a systems of thought or of works that combine certain aspects taken from various sources. For example, taking classical music or 80s pop music and applying it to images from today is an example of how you would use bricolage in order to create a postmodern piece. Lyotard explains that postmodern theory addresses the past periods of time in a chronological order, and based on this, postmodernism uses the diachrony of periods to remember the past and overcome it, and this combination of taking various concepts and putting them together is pertinent to how a postmodern thinker should strive to offer a new perspective or should break with tradition and begin a new way of living. This idea of questioning one's way of thinking led me to the concept of hyperreality. And most associated with hyperreality is Jean Baudrillard and his notion of the loss of the real. The loss of the real means that the distinction between what is true and what is false has become so blurred that the truth has been lost or hidden to the point of extinction. And Peter Berry explains Baudrillard's concept further by explaining the process of the sign and how it goes from a basic reality to no reality at all. And the sign, which represents the whole, portrays the basic reality. The second stage is when the sign is misrepresented or distorted. And then the sign disguises the fact that there is an underlying reality beneath the misrepresentation. Finally, the sign begins to bear no relation to reality at all. An example of this is She Kills Monsters, which I mentioned just a few seconds ago. Tilly, the main character, plays Dungeons and Dragons. And she uses Dungeons and Dragons to distort her reality and create an escape. And despite not reaching the final stage of hyperreality, She Kills Monsters is an example of hyperreality because Tilly has this reality which has been distorted by using real life people as characters in her D&D world. But she changes them just a bit in order to hide the underlying reality of the world. Once I had researched fragmentation, bricolage, and hyperreality, I applied it to a popular work of literature and film. Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange is a prime example of postmodern literature, but more specifically the character Alex. Alex has particular interests such as violence, viewing violence as a form of art, and it's his individual identity and refusal to conform, as Lyotard puts it, contributes to the emancipation of mankind, which is necessary in postmodern work. Alex is obsessed with classical music. More specifically, he's obsessed with Beethoven, and while committing random acts of violence, he listens to Beethoven because it calms him. And this creates a simulacrum that denotes representation, but also carries a sense of counterfeit or fake, according to Baudrillard. By combining violence and music, the meaning or interpretation is changed, and this has a form of fragmentation which has then led to bricolage, and later Alex is captured by the government and applied nice violent things to Beethoven in order to make him hate Beethoven and therefore hate violence. And by doing this, they are stripping Alex of the fragments that make up his personality. And this shows how fragmentation works in postmodernism by deconstructing something in the hopes of making it better. And furthermore, it creates a hyperreality for Alex in which he is trapped because there is now a fake reality in his mind. Contributing to the emancipation of mankind is the belief of both modernist and postmodernist. However, the difference between the two is a postmodernist's ability to achieve this emancipation by concerning themselves with fragmentation, bricolage, and hyperreality, as opposed to rejecting realism, focusing on the nostalgia that can be accompanied by the practice of hyperreality, instead of using that nostalgia to impart change and progress and limiting the idea of fragmentation, as opposed to using it to further mankind and its freedom. Postmodernism is believed to deconstruct the idea of the unitary end of history and the subject, therefore suggesting that fragmentation, bricolage, and hyperreality play key roles in analyzing art from a postmodern perspective. And after studying definitions and implications of fragmentation, bricolage, and hyperreality in relation to Lyotard's essay, Barth's essay, and then Baudrillard's, and then Peter Berry's idea of postmodernism, it's determined that all elements must be considered in creating or critiquing the postmodern piece of work. By tying in an example of a prevalent work of literature from pop culture, I was able to identify the necessary involvement of fragmentation, bricolage, and hyperreality to postmodern forms of art. And they should then become clearer and ought to provide a greater understanding of how postmodernism works in relation to the critique and theory of literature and other applicable art forms such as film, television, art, and philosophy. Thank you.